The quiet return home that wasn't. Danielle Rhodes had lived in Plano, Texas long enough to know the rhythms of her neighborhood. The lawns were always neatly trimmed, the driveways freshly power-washed, and the mailboxes stood like soldiers in a row, gleaming white with little brass numbers that caught the sun. It was the kind of neighborhood people dreamed of when they spoke about quiet suburbs, a place that promised safety, predictability, and community. For Danielle, it had been exactly that for 3 years, though she knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. She was 38, with a career that required her to blend into ordinary environments without ever revealing the extraordinary skill set she carried. To her neighbors, she was the well-organized professional woman who worked long hours, left early in the morning in her gray SUV, and sometimes returned home late at night with her gym bag slung over her shoulder. No one guessed that the woman who waved politely while carrying in groceries was an FBI tactical commander who had led high-stakes operations in cities across the country. This particular Saturday had begun like so many others, structured, efficient, and calm. Danielle had a knack for maximizing her weekends, turning even errands into a kind of mission plan. By 10 in the morning, she had checked off Target for household supplies, picked up dry cleaning, and made her way through the bustling farmer's market where she carefully selected crisp vegetables and herbs. She was the kind of woman who appreciated fresh tomatoes more than store-bought ones, who took pleasure in the smell of basil when she placed it into her shopping bag. By the time she turned into her neighborhood, the sun was already blazing in the sky, a reminder of Texas heat that seemed determined to smother everything it touched. Her trunk was packed with neatly arranged bags, and she was already calculating how quickly she could get them inside before the produce began to wilt. Danielle parked smoothly in her driveway, slid the gear into park, and gave herself a small smile. Home always felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could shed the armor of her profession and be simply herself. She pushed open the trunk, balancing 2 grocery bags in each hand, and began walking toward her front porch. The house stood proudly with its brick facade and navy shutters, the small front garden she had nurtured now bursting with bright marigolds and lavender. It was everything she wanted in a place to call home, warm, safe, and hers. But the safety she felt began to unravel almost immediately. Across the street, she noticed him, a man standing beneath the shade of a tree. His stance was rigid, arms crossed tightly over a neon yellow vest that seemed stretched to its limit across his middle. His mirrored sunglasses obscured his eyes, but Danielle could feel his gaze drilling into her as if cataloging her every movement. She was accustomed to scrutiny, her line of work demanded it, but this was different. This was invasive, personal, and dripping with unspoken hostility. Danielle's instincts sharpened the moment she caught sight of him. Training had conditioned her to assess environments in seconds, exits, sightlines, potential threats. Though she told herself to stay calm, to assume he was just a passerby or perhaps waiting for someone, she also noted the deliberate way he stood, the way he seemed to take up space not as a neighbor might, but as someone who wanted to assert authority. She shut the trunk with her elbow, adjusted her grip on the grocery bags, and walked up the path to her porch. The crunch of gravel under her shoes was suddenly joined by another sound, footsteps, heavy, determined, closing in. "Excuse me?" the man's voice barked in. He across the short distance, sharp and commanding. Danielle turned, her keys clutched in one hand, groceries dangling from the other. He was striding toward her now, each step brimming with a confidence that felt misplaced. Mid-40s, sunburnt skin around his neck, a thin mustache carefully trimmed. His security vest was paired with cargo pants and boots, and around his neck swung a laminated badge on a lanyard that already struck Danielle as suspiciously unofficial. "Yes?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with a quiet question. "This is a private neighborhood," he announced, his words clipped as though rehearsed. "I'm with the HOA security detail. I need to see some identification to confirm you actually live here." Danielle blinked, her expression neutral but her mind racing. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her belonging in spaces where she had every right to be, but it was rare to have it happen so brazenly on the steps of her own home. Her body remained perfectly still, a deliberate choice. Movement, even small, could escalate a situation like this, and she had no interest in giving him that power. "Excuse me?" she repeated, though this time there was an unmistakable edge beneath her voice. The man adjusted his vest, puffing his chest as though expanding his authority. "I said I need to see your ID. People have been walking around this neighborhood who don't live here. I'm not going to let that happen on my watch." Setting her bags carefully on the porch, Danielle straightened to her full height. She wasn't tall, but the confidence radiating from her posture made her presence commanding. "First of all," she said evenly, "you don't have the authority to demand anything from me. Second, I've lived here for 3 years. And third, you're standing on my property. You need to leave." The air seemed to thicken between them, silence stretching long enough for her to notice the ordinary sounds of suburban life, the laughter of children 2 houses down, the rhythmic buzz of a lawnmower somewhere nearby, a dog barking faintly in the distance. Everything felt amplified, a backdrop of normalcy clashing against the rising tension in her driveway. The man smirked, shaking his head slowly as though her words had proven something he had already decided. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard," he muttered. Danielle tilted her head slightly, giving him one last chance to reconsider. "Sir, I'll say this again. You're on my property. I don't owe you an ID, and I don't owe you an explanation. Move along." Neighbors were beginning to notice. Across the street, a woman tugged at her curtains to peek through the window. Further down, a teenager had paused his basketball game, the ball pressed against his hip as he squinted at the unfolding scene. Danielle's awareness cataloged it all, the witnesses, the setting, the implications. Her calmness wasn't just for herself. It was for the community watching, for the potential fallout of every word and every motion. But the man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You think people don't notice things? I see you coming and going. That car of yours, it doesn't quite fit around here, does it?" Danielle's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. She had heard this before, the coded language that attempted to disguise exclusion and bias, her gaze locked with his, unwavering, her tone carrying steel. "My car fits just fine, my house fits just fine, and whether you like it or not, I fit just fine." The words seemed to strike him, and his jaw clenched tightly, though he quickly masked it with a dry laugh. Still, Danielle saw his hand drift subtly toward his hip, brushing against something clipped beneath the hem of his vest. She recognized the gesture instantly. Her career had depended on reading micro-movements like these. Every nerve in her body told her what was coming. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice no longer simply defensive but edged with authority, "if you're about to do what I think you're about to do, I need you to think very carefully about the consequences. You're standing on someone's property in broad daylight. Neighbors are watching. You're already in the wrong. Don't make it worse." But instead of backing down, his lips curled into a smirk. "You talk a lot of big words for someone about to get herself into trouble." And then he moved. His hand snapped down, pulling a pistol free from his holster. Gasps rang out across the street, the metallic glint of the weapon catching sunlight like a signal flare. Danielle's muscles tightened, her training surging to the forefront, but she didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her hands. Her voice came low, deliberate, cutting through the sweltering air. "Put the gun away." The neighborhood had gone still, frozen in the gravity of the moment. What the guard did not know was that he had just drawn on the wrong person, because Danielle Rhodes was no ordinary homeowner. She was an FBI tactical commander, and this was about to become a lesson he would never forget. The commander, beneath the calm, the pistol gleamed in the sunlight, the man's hand gripping it with the false confidence of someone who believed a weapon made him powerful. Danielle stood perfectly still on her porch, groceries resting at her feet, keys caught loosely between her fingers. Every part of her body was alert, yet nothing. She about her betrayed the rising storm within her. This was not the first time she had faced a drawn weapon, nor was it the most dangerous scenario she had ever encountered, but what made it different was the setting, the supposed safety of her home, the watching neighbors, the absurdity of being treated like an intruder on her own property. She took a slow breath, her training guiding her. Assess, de-escalate, control the environment. Fear was the enemy here, and she refused to give it a place in her voice or in her posture. Across the street, the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath. Curtains were pulled back further, eyes wide, phones discreetly raised to capture video of the unfolding confrontation. A boy on his bike had frozen in the middle of the street, his front wheel wobbling as he tried to comprehend why a man in a neon vest was pointing a gun at a woman on her own front steps. Even the man watering his lawn 2 houses down had abandoned his hose, retreating slowly to the safety of his porch as he dialed a number on his phone with trembling fingers. These reactions mattered. They were witnesses, they were potential evidence, and they were also collateral if the situation exploded out of control. Danielle cataloged it all, her mind working through scenarios faster than most people could form a single coherent thought. The man with the gun smirked as though convinced the sight of the weapon had finally shifted the balance in his favor. He puffed out his chest, tightening his grip as if the weapon made him the ultimate authority. "I asked you nicely," he barked, his voice laced with triumph. "I gave you a chance to prove you belong here and you refused. That tells me everything I need to know." Danielle's eyes flicked to his stance, the way his feet were too close together, his weight uneven, his trigger finger trembling against the side of the pistol. He was not law enforcement, he was not military. He was a civilian playing dress-up in a role he did not understand, and that made him far more dangerous. An untrained man with a gun was unpredictable. Panic could pull the trigger as easily as intention. She had seen it happen before in raids and standoffs. Fear could be deadlier than malice. Her voice cut through the stillness, calm, even, but unyielding. "You are pointing a firearm at a lawful homeowner in front of half the neighborhood. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now." His jaw tightened. "Don't try to flip this on me. I know your type. People like you think rules don't apply, but I'm here to protect this community, and I won't be intimidated." Danielle tilted her head slightly, her expression one of quiet disbelief. She didn't need to raise her voice to command presence. She let silence linger just long enough to pull at his nerves, then spoke with a measured tone that carried weight beyond its volume. "What you are doing is not protection. It is escalation, and escalation has consequences. For you." The words seemed to rattle him, though he masked it with another dry laugh. He gestured with the gun, not quite aiming, but letting its presence speak for him. "You think you're clever. You think you can talk your way out. But I've been watching. I've seen the way you come and go. Your car, the hours, doesn't fit, doesn't belong, and I'm not the only one who thinks so." Danielle felt a pang in her chest, not of fear but of recognition. She had lived long enough to hear variations of the same accusation, the veiled language that cloaked prejudice under the guise of vigilance. But she also knew that responding with anger would feed him power, give him the reaction he was hoping to provoke. Instead, she straightened her posture, eyes locked on him with unblinking steadiness. "I don't need to justify myself to you," she said. "You are not law enforcement. You are not security. You are a man in a vest with a gun in his hand, and every second you stand here with that weapon pointed in my direction, you're digging yourself deeper into a hole you will not climb out of." The neighbors whispered among themselves, some recording, others speaking hurriedly into phones. Danielle could see movement behind her peripheral vision. Someone across the street had stepped onto their porch, gesturing frantically toward a phone pressed to their ear. Police were being called, she realized, though in her mind she weighed the irony of it. If officers arrived in the middle of this scene, they would see a black woman and a man with a badge, however fake it was, and a gun. That thought added another layer of urgency. She needed control, not chaos. The guard took a step closer, lowering his voice as though trying to reclaim dominance. "Last chance. Show me your ID or I swear this ends badly." Danielle's breathing slowed deliberately, her chest rising and falling with the kind of rhythm taught in advanced tactical training. It calmed her pulse, sharpened her focus. She was not the woman he thought she was, someone intimidated, cornered, desperate to prove herself. She was the commander who had stood in rooms full of armed suspects, who had led operations where split-second decisions determined life or death. This man had no idea who he was facing. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting like steel, "put the gun away, now, because if you take one step further with that weapon, you will find yourself in a situation you are not prepared to handle." Across the street, the teenager who had abandoned his basketball whispered frantically into his phone, describing what he saw. The woman with the floral blouse was still at her window, phone pressed so tightly to her ear it left a pale mark on her cheek. Danielle knew reinforcements were on their way, but she also knew that when police arrived, chaos could multiply if she didn't control this narrative before they set foot on the street. The optics were against her, a black woman on her porch, a man with a vest and a gun. Truth could be buried in assumptions if she didn't shape the moment carefully. And then the guard made his mistake. His ego, bruised by her refusal to yield, drove him forward. He jabbed the gun toward her, not firing, not even fully pointing, but the gesture was enough. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was her opening. Danielle moved with a precision that belonged to years of training. In one fluid step, she shifted off the line of his weapon, her left hand clamping down on his wrist, while her right hand struck the nerve cluster at his forearm. The gun loosened instantly, reflexively, his grip betraying him under the sudden shock of pain. Before he could process what happened, she twisted, redirected, and disarmed him with a motion so smooth it seemed choreographed. The pistol clattered against the concrete of her porch, and her foot was there before his hand could scramble for it, pinning it down. The neighbors gasped collectively, the sound almost like a wave breaking. The boy in the street shouted, "She took it! She took the gun!" And another window slammed open as someone yelled for the police to hurry. Danielle didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. Her focus remained on the man, whose face was now red with equal parts rage and shock. He had expected submission, not skill. He had expected to dominate, not to be dismantled in seconds. Her voice carried the calm of authority, each syllable cutting like steel. "This is over. You are done. Sit down." He snarled, trying to jerk his wrist free, but her grip tightened, leveraging his own momentum against him. She applied subtle pressure, not enough to break, but enough to remind him she could. The realization flickered across his face, and for the first time, he looked afraid. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, desperation leaking into his tone. Danielle leaned in closer, her voice low but lethal. "No, you don't know who you're messing with, and you just found out the hard way." She released him with a controlled push that sent him stumbling backward, his hands scrambling for balance. His chest heaved, his bravado unraveling in front of the neighbors who had once been his silent audience. The weapon remained pinned beneath her foot, out of his reach, out of his control. In the silence that followed, all eyes turned to her, not as a victim, not as a homeowner under siege, but as someone who had just displayed a level of composure and skill that defied explanation. The guard's breathing was ragged now, his arrogance cracking under the weight of exposure. He tried to speak, but words failed him. Danielle bent slowly, deliberately, picking up the pistol with the kind of expertise that left no question she knew exactly what she was doing. She ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set the weapon aside, far from both of them. Every motion was textbook, efficient, unmistakable. And it was in that moment that the neighbors began to understand. This was no ordinary woman. Danielle turned her attention back to him, her stance still commanding but not aggressive. "You've just endangered an entire neighborhood. You've drawn a firearm on a resident without cause, and you've humiliated yourself in front of witnesses who will tell the truth. When officers arrive, I suggest you stop talking, sit quietly, and prepare for the consequences of your choices." The man sputtered, trying to recover his authority. You don't get it. I was protecting this neighborhood. I was doing my job." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Your job was never to police residents. Your job was never to brandish a weapon against someone who lives here. And if you think that vest makes you untouchable, you're about to learn otherwise." The sound of sirens drifted faintly through the air, growing louder with each passing second. The guard froze, realization dawning on him that his world was about to collapse under the weight of accountability. Danielle didn't smile, didn't soften. Her gaze stayed steady, unwavering, a mirror of the strength she had honed through years of service. And then, for the first time, she gave the neighbors a glimpse of the truth. She reached into her back pocket, pulled out her leather badge case, and flipped it open just enough for the man to see. The gold glint of the FBI insignia caught the light, unmistakable, irrefutable. His mouth fell open, words collapsing before they could form. "You drew a gun on an FBI tactical commander," she said, her voice calm but resonant enough to cut through the air. And you did it on my property. The murmurs from the crowd swelled into a wave of astonishment. Phones recorded every word, every second. The boy on the bike whispered, "She's FBI," with awe in his voice. The guard staggered backward, his confidence draining from him like water through open hands. He had wanted to show dominance, but instead he had been exposed as a fraud in front of the entire community. The sirens grew louder now, unmistakably close. Danielle crossed her arms, standing tall on her porch, the discarded groceries at her feet now forgotten in the gravity of the moment. She had not raised her voice, had not lost control, had not given in to anger. She had done what she had always done: assess, act, and calm. And in doing so, she had transformed the scene from one of fear into one of revelation. The man looked around desperately as though searching for someone to back him up, but the neighbor's eyes told the story. They had seen it all. They had recorded it all. And when the authorities arrived, there would be no version of events he could twist to his advantage. Danielle didn't need to say another word. The balance had shifted entirely, and for the first time since he had confronted her, the guard realized the truth. He wasn't the one in control. He never had been. The reckoning on the street, the sound of sirens grew louder until it seemed to reverberate off the brick facades of every house on the block. Red and blue lights flashed against the quiet suburban street, casting fleeting shadows over manicured lawns and parked cars. Neighbors who had been hiding behind curtains now stepped outside, some with phones still raised, others standing in small clusters, whispering urgently about what they had just witnessed. For most of them, Saturday afternoons had never looked like this. They were used to block parties, the hum of lawnmowers, and the chatter of children, not the sight of a man in a neon vest being disarmed by the very woman he had tried to threaten. Two squad cars rolled to a stop in front of Danielle's house. The doors opened in unison, and officers stepped out quickly, hands already resting on their holsters, scanning the tense scene. Danielle stood tall on her porch, the disassembled firearm placed deliberately on the concrete step, her posture unflinching. The HOA guard, however, looked panicked, his face flushed, his hands raised halfway in a clumsy attempt to appear cooperative. His earlier bravado had crumbled, replaced now with the unmistakable expression of a man who understood that the weight of his choices was about to crush him. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp with practiced authority. Danielle responded immediately, raising her empty hands at shoulder height, calm and measured. She knew the importance of optics. She knew that arriving officers had only seconds to form conclusions. She would not risk escalation when the situation was already volatile. "Officer," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the driveway, "I am Special Agent Danielle Rhodes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The firearm is disassembled and on the ground at my feet. This man," she tilted her head toward the guard, "brandished it unlawfully on my property." The officers froze, exchanging startled glances. One of them approached cautiously, eyes darting between Danielle, the weapon, and the nervous man in the vest. "Ma'am, we'll need to verify." Danielle lowered her hands just enough to reach slowly into her back pocket. She retrieved her badge case, flipped it open, and extended it forward with deliberate clarity. The gold insignia of the FBI glinted in the sunlight, catching not only the officer's eyes but those of the neighbors watching. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. What had begun as suspicion and tension was transforming into awe. The officer took the badge, examined it carefully, and nodded once before returning it. "Agent Rhodes," he said, his tone instantly more respectful, "please stay right here while we sort this out." The guard erupted suddenly, his voice high-pitched and frantic. "She attacked me. She went for my gun. I was just doing my job protecting this neighborhood. She's lying." The officer nearest him frowned, stepping closer. "Sir, you need to calm down and keep your hands where I can see them. We're going to hear both sides, but right now you're the one who had a firearm out in a residential area. That's a serious issue." "She's making me look like the bad guy," he protested, pointing a trembling finger toward Danielle. "Shit. He doesn't even belong here. I know what I saw." Before he could finish, a voice rose from across the street. "That's not true." The woman in the floral blouse had stepped boldly onto her porch now, phone still in her hand. "I saw the whole thing." He followed her, demanded ID, and then pulled the gun first. "She didn't do anything wrong. She defended herself." Another neighbor chimed in, the teenager who had dropped his basketball. His voice cracked with nerves, but he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Yeah, I saw it too. She didn't even move until he pulled the gun. She took it from him because he was pointing it at her. The officers turned their attention back to the guard, who looked around wildly, his face flushing deeper as witness after witness began to speak up. Phones were raised higher now, recording everything. The officers, the guards' frantic denials, Danielle's composed stillness. The evidence was no longer confined to Danielle's words. It lived in the eyes and devices of nearly every person on the block. From down the street, a sleek black SUV rolled up and parked with deliberate precision. 3 individuals stepped out, members of the HOA board, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm. Word had spread quickly, and the board president, a tall man in a navy blazer despite the heat, hurried toward the officers. What is going on here? We were told there was an intruder situation. Danielle's eyes flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. The officer nearest him gestured for patience. Sir, this is an active investigation. Please stay back while we collect statements. But the guard seized the moment, desperate to salvage authority. That's them. That's the board. They'll tell you I was doing my job. I was hired to protect this neighborhood from people who don't belong. The board president's brow furrowed as he looked from the guard to Danielle. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the disassembled firearm. Is that true? He asked carefully. Danielle spoke before the guard could answer. Her voice was calm, steady, and every word measured. Your so-called security guard confronted me on my property, demanded identification he had no right to ask for, and escalated until he drew a weapon. He endangered me, this neighborhood, and himself. I disarmed him. He is lucky no one was hurt. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The board members shifted uneasily, their expressions darkening as the weight of her words settled on them. The president opened his mouth to respond, but Danielle raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone used to commanding rooms of chaos. Let me be clear, she continued. Neighborhood watch is one thing, but arming an untrained, unauthorized individual and giving him false authority is reckless. This man could have killed me. He could have killed a child riding his bike, a neighbor stepping outside. And the liability for that doesn't end with him. It extends to whoever put him in that vest and handed him that weapon. The silence that followed was profound. Even the guard, who had been sputtering moments earlier, stood slack-jawed, realizing she had not only dismantled him, but had aimed her words at the very structure that had empowered him. The officers exchanged glances again, one of them reaching for his radio. Dispatch, we've got 1 male in custody for brandishing a firearm and potential assault. Send additional units for evidence collection. The guard exploded. You can't do this to me. I was protecting the community. She's twisting everything. He thrashed as the officers moved to restrain him, his protests growing louder and more desperate, but the neighbor's eyes told the truth. The phones recording every second told the truth. The calm, steady woman standing on her porch told the truth. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Danielle felt no triumph, only the sober satisfaction of justice aligning itself with fact. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply watched as the man was led to the squad car, his vest crooked, his sunglasses slipping down his nose. He had entered this confrontation convinced he was the authority, but now he left exposed as a pretender who had nearly destroyed lives with his arrogance. The board president finally found his voice, though it shook slightly. Agent Rhodes, we had no idea. Danielle turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. You had every opportunity to know. The responsibility of leadership is not ignorance, it is accountability. And today, this neighborhood nearly paid the price for your failure to ensure the people you appoint are qualified and lawful. The man swallowed hard, nodding slowly as murmurs of agreement rose from the gathered neighbors. The board, once a distant authority, now stood under the same scrutiny they had imposed on others. Danielle had made certain of it. The officers collected statements, gathering testimony from the witnesses who eagerly recounted what they had seen. Each word painted the same picture. A man drunk on false power, a woman calm under fire, and a community forced to reckon with the danger born from negligence. Danielle remained patient through the process, her badge tucked away, her identity no longer in question, but inescapable fact. As the squad cars pulled away, the flashing lights fading down the street, the neighborhood stood in a hush of uneasy reflection. The guard was gone, but the echo of what had almost happened lingered. Danielle looked out at the faces turned toward her, not with suspicion now, but with respect, awe, and perhaps even guilt. She knew the moment would not fade quickly. Change never began quietly. It began with disruption, with confrontation, with truth laid bare under the harsh light of accountability. And in Plano, Texas, on that bright Saturday afternoon, the reckoning had only just begun. Lessons in the aftermath. The street gradually quieted after the squad cars departed, their sirens fading into the distance until all that remained was the hum of cicadas in the heavy Texas air. The neighbors lingered on their lawns, speaking in low voices, the shock of what they had witnessed written across their faces. The guard's absence left an almost eerie stillness, but the memory of his weapon glinting in the sunlight was still fresh, and no one doubted how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Danielle remained on her porch, standing tall, her presence radiating both calm and authority. To some, she was no longer just a neighbor carrying groceries, but a living reminder that strength does not always announce itself until it is tested. The HOA board members, visibly shaken, gathered at the edge of her driveway. Their polished confidence, once the shield they wore in community meetings, had been stripped away. The board president, still sweating in his blazer, cleared his throat. "Agent Rhodes," he began, his voice low and uneven, I want to apologize on behalf of the board. We had no idea something like this could happen." Danielle's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. She let the silence stretch for a moment before replying. "You should have known. Ignorance is not an excuse when lives are at stake. Leadership requires vigilance, accountability, and the humility to recognize where you failed. This community entrusted you with authority, and today you put that trust in the wrong hands." The board president swallowed hard, nodding slowly as murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered neighbors. His two fellow board members shifted uneasily, their expressions betraying the weight of her words. One of them finally spoke, her voice tight with guilt. "We thought hiring private security would reassure people. We didn't think it through." Danielle's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained resolute. Reassurance does not come from uniforms and vests. It comes from integrity, training, and transparency. When you put someone unqualified in a position of authority, you don't create safety, you create danger. And today that danger almost cost this community far more than you realize. The neighbors listened intently, some nodding, others looking down at the ground, grappling with their own reflections. Danielle could see it in their eyes, the dawning recognition that what they had witnessed was not just an isolated act of arrogance, but a symptom of deeper assumptions, of unchecked biases, of the fragile ways communities define belonging. From the back of the crowd, the teenager who had been dribbling his basketball earlier stepped forward. His voice was hesitant but clear. "Miss Rhodes, I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't just protect yourself. You protected all of us. He could have hurt someone." Danielle's expression softened. She crouched slightly so that she could meet the boy's eyes directly, her voice gentle but steady. "Courage doesn't always look like holding a weapon. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth, even when it's hard. You spoke up when it mattered. That makes you part of the reason this neighborhood is safer tonight." The boy's shoulders straightened, pride flickering across his face, and his parents behind him nodded with gratitude. Danielle stood again, turning back to the larger group. "What happened today isn't just about me or about him," she said, her voice carrying so that even those at the back could hear. "It's about all of us. It's about the kind of community you want to be. Do you want to be a place where suspicion and fear rule, or do you want to be a place where neighbors protect and respect each other? Because you cannot have both." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, pressing against every person standing there. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded with conviction, but all of them knew she was right. What had started as a confrontation between two individuals had become a mirror held up to the entire neighborhood. The board president finally removed his blazer, draping it over his arm as though shedding a layer of pretense. "You're right," he admitted. "We failed this community today, but we need to make it right. We'll hold an emergency HOA meeting, and this time we'll listen. We'll involve residents in decisions instead of making them behind closed doors. And I promise, we'll never put someone like him in a position of authority again. The sincerity in his tone did not absolve him, but it was a beginning. Danielle gave a small nod, accepting his words, but making it clear they would need to be proven through action. Good, she said simply. Because words are easy. It's what you do next that matters. The crowd began to thin as neighbors returned to their homes, their conversations quieter, more thoughtful. But something had shifted. They looked at Danielle differently now, not with the distant politeness of suburbia, but with genuine respect, even admiration. She had stood firm when others froze. She had revealed the truth when deception tried to dominate, and in doing so, she had given them all a lesson in dignity, strength, and accountability. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Danielle finally carried her groceries inside. The vegetables were slightly wilted, the ice cream half melted, but she didn't care. She set the bags on the counter, washed her hands, and leaned against the kitchen counter, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had navigated the confrontation without violence, without anger, and without compromising who she was. Her phone buzzed with a message. One of the neighbors she barely knew had texted to thank her for what she had done. Another message followed, offering to start a community dialogue about safety and bias. Danielle smiled faintly. Change would not happen overnight, but seeds had been planted, and sometimes that was enough to begin. As night fell and the streetlights flickered on, Danielle sat by her living room window, gazing out at the same quiet neighborhood she had entered earlier that day. But it no longer felt quite the same. It felt heavier, more complicated, but also filled with potential. Because now, everyone who had witnessed the confrontation knew that safety wasn't about who wore a vest or carried a weapon. It was about who had the courage to act with integrity when it mattered most. And Danielle Rhodes, FBI tactical commander and neighbor, had reminded them of that truth in the most unforgettable way possible.